Hey everyone, welcome to the video. If you're new to the channel, my name is Solomon Thomas. I'm a Marine Corps veteran. I just got my master's in general psychology, and I have the goal of becoming a clinical psychologist and a professor one day. So I'm making these YouTube videos to practice articulating my thoughts and clarifying my beliefs on different ideas related to psychology and philosophy. And I also hope that some of these ideas may be found useful or interesting or engaging to anyone out there who's listening. So I'm currently in the middle of making a series of YouTube videos that I'm calling Personality Dynamics, for lack of a better title. I'm trying to understand what a personality is, but probably more importantly, what it means to optimally develop an adaptive personality. I think that the solution to that investigation, perhaps, will be found in the elucidation of the frame problem and some of its concurrent or potential solutions that have manifested from different disciplines such as cybernetics, neuropsychology, and depth psychology for that matter. So this series so far is going to be concentrated on the frame problem and its different solutions from different disciplines. In the first video, I introduced the frame problem and talked about it from a cybernetic perspective. In this video, I'll try to recap the first video, but then place an emphasis on neuropsychology. In the next video, I think, I'll focus on depth psychology, talk about Sigmund Freud, Adler, and Jung. And then in the final video, hopefully, I'll do an overview, recap, and emphasize potential implications for those first few questions that I just talked about. What is a personality? What does it mean for a personality to transform and develop? And what does it mean for an individual to develop their personality optimally? So let's recap the first video. One of the fundamental problems that humans, animals, more broadly, have to solve is conceptualized as the frame problem. And the frame problem essentially says that in a given environment, there is a near infinite amount of information available to the conscious organism. So, also given that the conscious organism is limited and cannot process or comprehend all of the information, how do we perceive and act in that environment? By deciphering and delineating what is relevant and what is irrelevant. In the first video, I tried to talk about the different potential solutions to that frame problem from a cybernetic perspective. And to try to sum it up, the cyberneticians such as Norbert Wiener and William Ross Ashby and others would say that we solve the frame problem by only paying attention to that which is relevant to our goals and our values in the environment. So many of our reference values would be the technical term. Many of our values come from the fact that we are embodied creatures. And given that we're embodied creatures, we have certain variables that can be called essential variables that we have to maintain ourselves within a certain range. So for humans, this would be something like hunger levels, thirst levels, temperature regulation, focusing on hunger and thirst, just as examples. When it comes to our food intake, we don't want to be too hungry because then we'll die, but we also don't want to eat too much or else we'll have pain, our stomachs will explode maybe, or we will feel a lot of discomfort that could also lead to dangerous outcomes. Thirst may be a better example. We don't want to become too dehydrated because then we'll die, but we also don't want to drown because then we'll also die. So we have these different variables that we have to maintain ourselves within, and these come to us pre-wired through the course of evolution. They're there innate when we're born. So we aren't blank slates that are approaching these environments with all of their complexity without any type of biasing or motivational frame that tells us a priori what's important to us. We have these different reference values or essential we have these different reference values or essential variables that indicate to us what is relevant and what's irrelevant in the environment. Another component of how we solve the framing problem also relates to learning about what's relevant in relation to those reference values. So not only do we come prepared to drink water and to desire water, for example, we also have the ability to learn what objects or phenomena in the environment can lead us to water, or what objects or phenomena in the environment can make us more thirsty, which would be considered a bad thing. And so we have this combination of innate predictions or desires that bias what we see in the world, but then we also have this capacity to learn about what's relevant and irrelevant in the world that continues to refine our interpretive structure that enables us to solve the frame problem. Other components related to the cybernetic solution to the frame problem involved feedback loops, which are control mechanisms that consist of inputs. So for humans, we have sensory organs that allow us to intake information from the environment, outputs, which would be like our actions, reference values, which we've just spoken about, and a comparing mechanism that drives behavior as the comparing mechanism checks our current inputs, our current sensations, and compares that to the reference value. And if there's a negative feedback loop, then outputs are created to the degree that there's a discrepancy between the current value and the reference value, so that that distance can decrease, and that's why it's negative. And then if it's a positive feedback loop, whenever we set a goal or a reference value, we use our perceptions to establish our current state, and with the positive feedback loop, outputs are generated to increase that distance. And there are personality psychologists such as Charles Carver and Michael Shire. They wrote a book called On the Self-Regulation of Behavior. And in that book, they posited what are called anti-goals, which is just another way to discuss positive feedback loops. And so you could set the anti-goal of wanting to run away from a car that's chasing you or an animal that's chasing you. And so you'll see that you're currently close to this danger and you want to run away from the danger. And so the positive feedback loop would create behavior to increase that distance. So that's another cybernetic principle that mediates how we use our motivated frame of reference to filter out the information in the world and solve the frame problem. So in this video, that was a long introduction. What I want to do now is try to instantiate those cybernetic principles into neuropsychological terms. And part of the reason I want to do that is because I am trying to come to the conclusion that we see the world through a story, which is kind of a backwards way of thinking about things. When it comes to thinking about different ideas, you can set the conclusion and then find a whole bunch of information to confirm your hypothesis or confirm your conclusion, which some people might say is confirmation bias, or you can find the data and then interpret the data in itself and enable the facts to generate some sort of organic, bias-free conclusion. But on multiple levels, what I'm trying to discuss in this video is the fact that there is no such thing as interpreting the data in itself and then drawing a conclusion on your own, bias-free. What I'm trying to say is that we have to solve the frame problem, and part of the way that we solve the frame problem is by overlaying an interpretive structure that's embodied, that's cognitive, that's emotional, that's motivational, that's linguistic in part, that filters out the information that you deal with, that filters out the raw data that you could contend with. So no matter what, you're biased. So that's just a little tangent. But I'm trying to hit this idea that we see the world through a story from different angles that are relatively independent. So when it comes to the cybernetic formulation of a solution to the frame problem, you can think of a reference value, the inputs in a feedback loop, so your current state, the outputs, the actions, as a story. The reference value is the goal, it's your intentions, it's the plot of the story. The current inputs, that's the beginning state, that's where you are. And the successful execution of outputs that turn your current state into your desired state, into the reference value, could consist of the middle of the story. So that was one way of trying to get to the idea that we have to simplify all of the complexity in the world, in our environment, so that we can act and perceive. And one of the ways that we do that from a cybernetic perspective is to overlay a framework of value onto the world that biases what we see. And another way of thinking of that framework of value is just as a story. So now, moving into the neuropsychological realm, I think the easiest way to do this would be to just translate the cybernetic principles of, say, reference values and feedback loops into the domain of human biology and the human nervous system. So let's start with reference values. Again, a dynamic system, a system in general, for it to exist, must have certain essential variables that the system seeks to stay within. Again, for humans, we don't want to be too hungry, we don't want to be too stuffed, we don't want to be too thirsty, we don't want to drown in water, right? These essential variables can also be considered our reference points, and this desire of a system to maintain itself is very akin to homeostasis and motivation. And then we can start thinking about, well, what biological structures mediate the function of motivation and homeostasis in the human. And one likely contender there is the hypothalamus. So when we think about reference values and motivations, let me try to flush that out a little bit more. When you're motivated, you have a goal in your mind, or you have a goal that's embodied that you're trying to move towards, and you also realize that you're not at that goal yet, right? Which is kind of implied, but I'm bringing that up to highlight that there are different components and functions that are necessary for motivation to exist. So going back to our simple example of being thirsty, to be motivated is to know that you want to drink some water, and to also know that your current state is devoid of water, which is what thirst is. And this capacity to assess where you currently are and where you want to go, that distance between the two is motivation. And I'm really pulling that from Jaak Panksepp, who is the founder of affective neuroscience, who essentially defined motivation as a feeling that relates to a homeostatic imbalance. And if we accept this definition of motivation as it relates to homeostatic imbalance, we can then look at one likely contender that mediates homeostasis, which would be the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is an ancient part of the brain that has many functions, but three of the primary functions that I'll detail here are related to mediating motivated behavior, tracking internal bodily states, and establishing the level of positive or negative value when it comes to emotional stimuli in the world. So I'm not going to do it in that order, but the hypothalamus, particularly this is coming from the work of Larry Swanson, has been considered the central pattern controller in the human motor nervous system. So the way that Larry Swanson details it out, he looks at the whole human nervous system. He has a book called Brain Architecture, I believe. And in that book, he splits the human nervous system into the cognitive system, the sensory system, the motor system, and the behavioral state system. Now, looking at the motor system, he views it as a hierarchy, where at the top is a central pattern controller, and that communicates to the central pattern initiator, which communicates to different parts of the nervous system, of the motor nervous system distributed throughout your body, that enables you to act and move in the world. And a key component there is, given that the hypothalamus is tightly associated as the central pattern controller in this paradigm, one of the implications you can take is that your behaviors, whether they're reflexive or they're somatic, say voluntary, or they're tightly related to hormonal actions internally, they're not random. They're motivated. If we accept that the hypothalamus is the central pattern controller and that it also tracks your various internal bodily states and assesses when you're thirsty or when you're hungry or when you're too hot or too cold, well, then we can perhaps draw a tight association between your posited reference values, your desired future states, your goals, your capacity to assess your current state, and the motivation or the distance between those two that relates to your actions that you're doing on a daily basis or that you're executing in your environment. Okay, so that's kind of my attempt to ground reference values in motivation from a psychological perspective, which would then be grounded in large part with the hypothalamus in the nervous system. One more component I forgot. The hypothalamus also, it doesn't necessarily set what is positive or negative in the world or rewarding or punishing as you're going through your environment. There's dangers that are negative, or there are threats or things that you think that are dangerous that evoke negative emotion, and there are things that are positive that make you want to move towards them or they are rewarding. So your amygdala would say in a binary fashion, and this is a simplification, that this information over here is negative and this information over here is positive. However, the hypothalamus would regulate just how punishing or how rewarding those various stimuli are. And I think this is something that we all experience phenomenologically. If you're really thirsty, which would be a motivation that's tracked in large part by your hypothalamus, cold water is more rewarding and it feels better compared to if you're not thirsty at all, or if you've already drinking a lot of water. At some point, water becomes what's the word I'm looking for? Aversive, is that the word? It becomes negative because you've drank it so much, or maybe you've eaten a lot of food, and when you were hungry initially, the food was really good and it tasted better than usual, perhaps. But as you are satiated, the reward value in food, which again the amygdala would say is positive, diminishes. So that's just another key component to keep in mind when thinking about the hypothalamus, and more evidence in my mind for why the hypothalamus is a likely contender for the biological instantiation of reference values. Okay. Now, what about inputs, outputs, and the comparing mechanism that kind of rounds out how reference values guide behavior and enable us to solve the frame problem and act in the world? Inputs. What are the biological substrates of inputs? Pretty simple. Should be our sensory organs. Outputs, we already talked about the motor system from the perspective of Larry Swanson. So outputs are just behavior. Now, what would be the comparing mechanism that enables us to take the reference value, assess our current states via our sensory organs, and determine the distance between the two and whether or not outputs should be generated? And moving forward, let's assume a negative feedback loop. So what will happen is we'll set a goal, we'll assess our current state, and we want to transform the current state into the desired state. So that'll be a negative feedback loop. The comparator, the comparing mechanism for our feedback loops, I think is likely to be found in the hippocampus. And this primarily comes from the work of Jeffrey Gray and Neil McNaughton. They wrote a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety. A third edition of the book just came out last year, and it initially came out in the 1980s. So it's just interesting to me to see how theories can survive and how new data either confirms or denies them. And I would imagine that to the degree that the theory has maintained itself over the decades, that by and large, new data as it has emerged has just confirmed many of the principles that were asserted at the onset. So, according to these researchers, when you're pausing a goal and you're acting in the world, what's active is the behavior activation system. And this consists of different parts of your brain that enable you to just keep moving forward. Now, anxiety, from their perspective, was mediated by a system called the behavior inhibition system that consisted of parts of the hypothalamus, which we spoke of earlier, the septohippocampal system, which is most important, which we will focus in on, parts of the amygdala, and different neurotransmitter systems such as norepinephrine or noradrenaline and serotonin. For these researchers, this is how it worked in a simple way. You're going about your day and you are using your long-term memory, knowledge from your long-term memory, to posit a desired future, a desired outcome that you want to come into existence. And just like our feedback loops, you have a reference value, you have a goal, something that you want to accomplish, and you're able to sense your current state. And as long as you're making progress towards that current state, then things are fine. There's like slight positive emotion that's enabling you to make it through your day, but there's not really a lot of negative emotion. And to be clear, it's not just that you set one goal and you accomplish that goal and that's it. Every behavior and perception could be thought of as nested hierarchies of goals, right? So I'm trying to make this YouTube video, and so to make this YouTube video, I have to sit down in this chair, and prior to sitting down in this chair, I was over there on the couch, and so I had to take one step over here and then another step, and so on and so forth. So that complicates matters, but yeah, I think that's sufficient for now. You're going through life, you're accomplishing these goals, you're setting these goals, and then you're detailing out action patterns that you've learned that in the past have successfully enabled you to accomplish those goals, and you're executing them in the present. If something doesn't go as planned, this is where the behavior activation system comes into play. And within that system would be the septohippocampal system. And primarily in the hippocampus, there are two streams of information. One of those streams of information has to do with the desired outcome that you want, and another stream has to deal with current sensory perceptions. And part of what the hippocampus does is check for matching between those two streams of information. And as long as those two streams of information match, where you set a goal, you accomplish the goal, you set a goal, you accomplish the goal, you set a goal, current sensations are turning into that desired model of the world, then things are fine. The behavior activation system, which is related to positive emotion, remains active. Now, if there's a mismatch, which is what happens when something anomalous or novel or unexpected happens, the hippocampus senses this mismatch and then triggers a cascade of events that are related to anxiety that, from the perspective of this theory, just is anxiety that freezes current behavior, so it inhibits current behavior and inhibits the behavior activation system, increases your arousal, increases your attention towards negative information in the world, and if this scenario sustains itself, triggers exploratory behavior either in the world or exploratory thinking through your mind to try to resolve that goal conflict, is one way to think of it, to try to resolve that mismatch. Now, without getting into any further into that, the reason I'm saying all of this is because just to round out how I think these cybernetic functions that I talked about in the first video and I just recapped in this video, which I think solve the frame problem, can be grounded in the neuropsychology of anxiety, but more broadly, the neuropsychology of the human nervous system. And ideally, with this video and with this series, what I'm trying to do is just move from, this abstract frame problem that deals with complexity and chaos and information in the world, to how, broadly speaking, dynamic systems, anything from thermometers to anti-artillery guns to fish to animals, how dynamic systems solve the frame problem, then ground that into biology, into the human nervous system, and then from there speak about psychological matters. And I think that the work by Jeffrey Gray and Neil McNaughton and Larry Swanson with the hypothalamus have enabled us to make the point that reference values are mediated primarily by the hypothalamus. Inputs and outputs are mediated by sensory organs and our motor system. And the comparing mechanism that really brings everything together and allows the reference values via negative feedback loops to control our perceptions and actions. I think that this biological work makes that association work. Yeah, I think that's it. I think I'm also going to stop the video there so that way this won't run too long. Okay. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.